There is a room in Vienna that almost no one has ever seen. It sits behind a locked door on the third floor of a building that no longer exists as it once did, rebuilt, repurposed. Its history mostly forgotten by the people who walk past it every morning on their way to work. But inside that room, in the years when it still held its contents, there were shelves, long shelves, floor to ceiling, running the full length of 4 walls. And on those shelves, resting in careful rows, labeled in a small and precise handwriting, were skulls. Not the skulls of criminals, not the skulls of the poor, sold anonymously to medical schools. These skulls had names, they had dates, they had histories attached to them in ink so faded now that it takes a magnifying glass and patience to read. And some of them, not all, but some had once rested on pillows of silk, in chapels and crypts and cathedrals, belonging to men and women whose faces had appeared on coins. This is the story of the man who gathered them. His name was Anton Schreiber. He was born in 1,791 inches, a small town in Lower Austria that no longer appears on any modern map. He trained as an anatomist. He became, over the course of 40 years, one of the most obsessive collectors of human remains in the history of European medicine. And when he died, in 1867, at the age of 76, the inventory of his collection filled 3 separate ledger books. This episode is not about death. It is about the strange, persistent, very human need to hold on to things, to keep what the world says should be let go, to believe that a bone, even after everything else is gone, still carries something of the person it once was. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin with a boy and a drawer full of teeth. Anton Schreiber was 8 years old the first time he understood what a skull meant. His father was a butcher in the market town of Hollenstein and Darjibs, a place known for its pine forests and its cold rivers and not much else. The elder Schreiber was a practical man, not given to sentiment or philosophy, and the work of a butcher in 1799 was not a gentle one. Bones were a constant presence in the Schreiber household. Bones in the kitchen, bones in the yard, bones stripped clean and boiled down for stock. Anton grew up understanding that the body was a structure, a framework, and that what was inside it, the soft parts, the living parts, was temporary. But there was a skull in the church. The parish church of Hollenstein was old enough that several generations of the local nobility had been buried beneath its stone floor, and the charnel house behind the sacristy held the accumulated bones of several hundred years of the faithful. Most children in the town were frightened of the charnel house. Anton was not. He went there alone on a Tuesday afternoon in October when the priest was visiting a sick parishioner 3 villages away, and he sat on the cold ground and looked at the skulls arranged along the lowest shelf, and he thought with the particular clarity that sometimes visits 8-year-olds and almost never revisits them as adults that these were not frightening at all, they were interesting. He picked one up. He turned it over in his hands. The bone was smooth and very light, lighter than he expected, and yellowish in a way that reminded him of old candle wax. The eye sockets were deep and symmetrical. The jaw was missing. He held it for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe more, and then he put it back on the shelf exactly as he had found it. On the walk home, he made a decision that he would not have been able to articulate had anyone asked him. He had decided that he wanted to understand what these things were, not spiritually, not religiously, structurally. He wanted to know how a human head was built. It would take him another 15 years to find a context for that interest, but the interest itself never left him. In the early 19th century, the study of human anatomy in Austria was regulated, restricted, and only intermittently available to young men from provincial families without connections. The great anatomical theaters of Vienna were attached to the university, and the university was attached, in various invisible ways, to money and to social class, and to the recommendations of the right kind of people. Anton Schreiber had none of these things when he arrived in Vienna in 1811, at the age of 20, carrying a letter of introduction from the parish priest of Hollenstein and almost no money. He found work first as a porter at the General Hospital, the Allgemeines Krankenhaus, a vast, sprawling complex on the edge of the city where the sick came to be treated and, with some regularity, to die. The morgue of the Allgemeines Krankenhaus was, in those years, one of the busiest in Europe. Schreiber worked as a porter for 2 years. In that time, he taught himself to read medical Latin from a textbook he found discarded in a stairwell. He introduced himself, quietly and persistently, to every physician and assistant who would speak to him. He made himself useful. He was, by all accounts that survive, a quiet and methodical young man, not prone to outbursts or grand gestures, with a particular gift for stillness, for sitting with a problem, turning it over, examining it from different angles, until he understood it. In 1813, a professor of anatomy named Franz Berger agreed to take him on as an unofficial assistant. Berger was known in the university as a difficult man, exacting, impatient with stupidity, and not particularly interested in the social niceties that governed academic life. He was also, when it came to the architecture of the human body, one of the finest minds of his generation. He saw something in Schreiber that was worth cultivating, and he cultivated it. Under Berger, Schreiber learned to dissect with precision. He learned the names of every bone, every suture, every ridge, and groove and foramen in the human skull. He learned that the skull was not one bone but 22, fused together over the course of childhood into what appeared to be a single continuous structure. He learned that each of those 22 bones had a name, a history, a function. He learned that no two skulls were exactly alike, and he learned something else, something that Berger taught him not by saying it directly, but by the way he handled specimens. He learned that a skull, held carefully, in the right light, with the right attention, was capable of telling you things. Not secrets, not supernatural revelations, but information. Quiet, structural, patient information about the person who had once lived inside it. Schreiber never forgot that lesson. It would drive the next 50 years of his life. Schreiber was 30 years old when he first came into possession of what he believed to be a royal skull. He had by then established himself as a minor but respected figure in Viennese anatomical circles. He had his own small practice. He taught occasional lectures at the university as a guest, though he held no permanent position. He had published 2 papers, one on the morphology of the orbital bones, one on the variation in cranial suture patterns across different populations that had been received with polite interest and no great excitement. He lived alone in 4 rooms above a printer's shop in the 2nd district. He was, in most outward respects, unremarkable. But he had been collecting for 8 years by then. Not royal skulls, those would come later. He had been collecting skulls from the anatomical theater, from the hospital morgue, from gravediggers who were willing, for a modest sum, to provide specimens from the older sections of the municipal cemeteries. By 1821, he had approximately 60 skulls in his apartment, labeled and cataloged in a system of his own devising, measured and described in the 3rd of a series of notebooks that he filled with a dense, careful script. The 61st skull was different. It came to him through a man named Kreitner, a dealer in antiquities and curiosities who operated from a shop near the Naschmarkt and who knew, from years of dealing with the peculiar tastes of Viennese collectors, that Schreiber was interested in unusual specimens. Kreitner had acquired the skull, he said, from a gravedigger who worked at the imperial crypt at the Augustinian church, the Herzgruft, the heart crypt, where the hearts of the Habsburgs were kept in silver urns. The skull, Kreitner claimed, had come from a subsidiary vault that was being reorganized, and had somehow, he was vague on the specifics, found its way into the world above ground. Schreiber did not ask too many questions. He paid what Kreitner asked, which was considerably more than he paid for ordinary specimens, and he carried the skull home, wrapped in cloth, and set it on his workbench, and looked at it for a very long time. He could not verify the provenance. He had no way of knowing, in 1821, whose skull it was, or whether Kreitner's story was true or a complete fabrication designed to inflate the price of what might have been an entirely ordinary specimen. But the skull was old. The bone had the particular density and coloration of something that had spent a long time in the ground. The sutures were fused in the pattern of a mature adult. And there was something else, a small mark on the inner surface of the frontal bone, a careful incision made at some point after death, of the kind that Schreiber associated with the embalming practices of the Habsburg court. He wrote in his notebook that evening, "Specimen 61. Provenance uncertain, but possibly significant. Origin claimed. Subsidiary vault, imperial crypt, Augustinian church, Vienna. Transferred via Kreitner. 14 March 1821. Male, probable age at death 45 to 55 years. Distinctive incision, frontal bone, interior surface, consistent with court embalming practice. To be investigated further, he investigated it for the rest of his life without reaching a definitive conclusion. The skull sat on the highest shelf of his collection, wrapped in a separate cloth, listed in a separate section of his catalog, under the heading, Specimens of Uncertain but Potential Historical Significance. It was the first entry in that section. It would not be the last. The skull is the map, the man is the territory. Study the map carefully enough, and you will understand the territory. To understand why Anton Schreiber and hundreds of other collectors and physicians across Europe in the first half of the 19th century were so intensely interested in skulls, you have to understand phrenology. Phrenology is not taken seriously today. It is taught, when it is taught at all, as an example of how scientific-sounding frameworks can be built around entirely false premises. But in 1820, it was one of the most exciting ideas in European intellectual life. Its founder, Franz Joseph Gall, had proposed that the brain was divided into distinct organs, each responsible for a different mental faculty, and that the shape of the skull reflected the development of those underlying organs. Study the bumps and hollows of a person's skull, Gall argued, and you could read their personality, their intelligence, their moral character, their aptitudes and deficiencies as clearly as you could read a printed page. Gall was wrong. The brain does not work the way he described, and the skull does not map onto the brain the way he claimed. But the idea was seductive because it offered something that people desperately wanted in the early 19th century: a system, a method, a way of turning the invisible interior of a human being, all that inaccessible thought and feeling and intention, into something you could see and touch and measure. For Schreiber, phrenology was not the point. He was rigorous enough and skeptical enough to have doubts about Gall's more extravagant claims even in the 1820s. But phrenology gave him a framework in which his collecting made sense not just to him, but to the world around him. A physician who collected skulls for phrenological research was doing science. He was building a database. He was contributing to the understanding of the human mind. And if that database happened to include skulls from crypts and vaults and the resting places of the historically significant, well, the historical dimension only made the scientific dimension more interesting. This was the justification Schreiber gave in the letters he wrote and the conversations he had and the papers he occasionally published. Whether it was the real reason, whether the collecting had always been something else, something more private and less easily explained, is a question the historical record cannot answer. Only Schreiber knew, and Schreiber, characteristically, did not say. There is a question that follows naturally from what we know about Schreiber's collection, and it is not a comfortable one. How does a private individual in the 19th century come into possession of the skulls of kings and queens? The answer is more complex and more interesting than simple grave robbery, although grave robbery was certainly part of it. In the Vienna of the 1820s and 1830s, the bones of the historically significant were less securely guarded than we might imagine. The great imperial crypts, the Kaisergruft beneath the Kapuziner Kirche, where the bodies of the Habsburgs lay in elaborate bronze sarcophagi, and the Herzgruft in the Augustinian Church, where their hearts were kept separately, were maintained by the Church, not by the state. Access to the subsidiary vaults, the older sections, the areas that had not been officially visited in decades, was controlled by a small number of monks and custodians who were, like people everywhere, susceptible to money. Schreiber did not deal with the custodians directly. He was too careful for that, too aware of the legal and social risks. Instead, he worked through intermediaries, Kreitner, and later several other dealers who understood his interests, and he paid for discretion as well as for specimens. He asked no questions about how things had been obtained. He provided the money. The chain between the money and the specimen was long enough that he could, if challenged, claim ignorance. He was never challenged. But grave robbery was only one method, and probably not the most common one. The 19th century was an era of renovations. Crypts were reorganized. Old churches were rebuilt or demolished. Cemeteries were consolidated as cities grew. In the process of all this reorganization and rebuilding, bones appeared. Old bones. Bones that had been in the ground for centuries and that now, displaced from their original resting places, entered a kind of legal and moral limbo. Schreiber was very good at finding out about these renovations. He had contacts in the church, in the municipal government, in the construction trades. When work was being done on an old vault or a historic churchyard, he was often among the first to know. He would appear quietly, professionally, with his notebooks and his instruments, and he would examine what had come to light and make his offers, and, if the offers were accepted, arrange for transport. He also acquired specimens through correspondence. By the 1830s, he had built a network of contacts across the German-speaking world and beyond physicians, antiquarians, custodians of historic sites who knew his interests and who would write to him when something came to their attention. Some of these correspondents were motivated by money. Some were motivated by the idea of contributing to science. Some were simply pleased to have found someone who would take seriously what others dismissed as inconvenient old bones. And then there was the third method, the one Schreiber was most reluctant to describe in his notebooks, but which appears, in oblique references and careful omissions, to have been real. Direct purchase from individuals who had access to historic collections and who were willing, under the right circumstances, to sell. By 1835, Schreiber had 312 skulls in his collection. Most of them were ordinary in the sense that their owners had been ordinary people, the poor and the unknown whose bones moved through the anatomical economy of the 19th century without ceremony or documentation. These were the foundation of the collection, the baseline against which the significant specimens could be measured and compared. But there were others. By 1835, the section of his catalog headed Specimens of Uncertain but Potential Historical Significance had grown to 19 entries, and 3 of those entries had been promoted in a second catalog that Schreiber kept separately under lock and key to a higher category. The higher category had no printed heading. At the top of the first page, in Schreiber's small and careful handwriting, were 2 words, Die Bedeutenden, the significant. The first entry in Die Bedeutenden was specimen 61, the skull from the Augustinian crypt, unidentified. The second was a skull, acquired in 1829 from a dealer in Prague, who claimed it had come from the crypt of St. Vitus Cathedral, the resting place of Bohemian kings. This one had documentation, of a kind, a handwritten note in what appeared to be 17th century German, found with the specimen, that named it as the skull of a specific king. Schreiber was not certain the note was genuine. He was not certain it was not. He kept both possibilities alive in his mind, as he kept many things suspended, unresolved, waiting for more evidence. The third was different. The third had no documentation at all, but it had something more compelling than documentation. It had a wound. The wound was on the left side of the skull, in the temporal region, a fracture, clearly made by a sharp-edged instrument, from the outside. The bone had partially healed around the wound, which meant the person had survived it, at least briefly. And the nature of the fracture, the angle and depth of it, was consistent with what Schreiber had read about the injuries sustained by certain historical figures in the course of certain historical events. He was careful in his notes. He did not write a name. He wrote, consistent with the documented injuries of a significant figure of the 15th century. Further investigation required. He spent 20 years on that further investigation. He wrote letters to archives in 3 countries. He traveled twice to examine related physical evidence. He read everything that had been written on the subject. He never reached a conclusion he was willing to publish. But the skull remained in his collection. It remained in Die Bedeutenden, and every time he opened that cabinet, it was the one he reached for first. In 1838, Anton Schreiber moved his collection into a proper house. He had by then accumulated enough income from his practice and his occasional university lectures to afford a lease on a tall, narrow building near the Graben, in the center of Vienna, 3 floors plus a set of attic rooms. The ground floor became his consulting rooms. The second floor became his living quarters. And the third floor, all of it, became the collection. He hired a carpenter to build shelving to his specifications deep shelves, set at the correct height for a skull to sit without touching the shelf above it, with small wooden brackets at the front of each position to prevent movement in transit. He hired a glazier to fit the windows with opaque glass to reduce the light, He installed a system of wooden drawers beneath the main shelving for the smaller specimen's teeth, individual bones, the fragments that arrived without their complements. And he spent 3 weeks working mostly alone, transferring every specimen from its previous location to its new home. He handled each one. He checked the label against the catalog entry. He noted any changes, new cracks, any deterioration since the last examination, anything worth recording. He set each skull in its position and stepped back and looked at it. When it was done, he stood in the middle of the room, a tall man, angular in the way of men who forget to eat, with white hair that had arrived prematurely and a habit of holding his hands clasped behind his back, and looked at what he had built. 408 skulls, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, in a room that smelled of old bone and beeswax, and the faint residue of the preservatives he used. The afternoon light came through the opaque glass in a diffuse, gray-white glow that made the specimens look as though they were resting in water. He did not record, in any document that survives, what he felt in that moment. He was not a man who wrote about feelings, but he stayed in the room for a long time. His housekeeper, who would normally have called him for dinner at 6, found him there when she came to the door at 7:30, still standing, still looking. She said later that he looked satisfied, not proud, satisfied. The way a man looks when a thing he has been working on for a very long time is finally, provisionally, approaching something like completion. Schreiber was not entirely reclusive. By the early 1840s, his collection was known, quietly, among the medical and scientific community in Vienna, and he had developed a careful policy regarding visitors. He would show the collection, by appointment only, to physicians and researchers who had a legitimate professional interest. He would not show it to the merely curious, to sensation seekers, or to journalists. He would not discuss the provenance of the specimens beyond what was in his published papers. He would answer questions about anatomy, about measurement, about the physical characteristics of the skulls. He would not answer questions about where specific skulls had come from or whose they might be. This policy protected him. It also, inevitably, created the impression that there was something to protect. Word spread, as it does in the world of small and specialized collections. There were rumors. The rumors were, in the way of rumors, both more dramatic and less precise than the reality. People said Schreiber had the skull of a medieval emperor. They said he had something from the Habsburgs. They said he had paid enormous sums for things that should not have been for sale. Some of this was true, some of it was not. Schreiber did not correct the record. Among his actual visitors in the 1840s were several notable figures in European science, including a young physician from Prague named Rokitansky, who would later become one of the founders of modern pathology, and an English naturalist named Galton, who was, at that stage of his career, still figuring out what he believed about human variation. Both men wrote about their visits in letters that have survived. Both were impressed by the organization of the collection. Both were slightly unsettled by the room itself, by the sheer number of the specimens, and by the calm, methodical way Schreiber moved among them. Galton wrote, "He handles them as a librarian handles books, without ceremony, but not without respect. Each one is a document, in his view, and he is the only person who can read them." It was, Galton added, a slightly unnerving quality in a human being. At its peak, the private catalog that Schreiber kept under lock and key die Bedeutenden contained 11 entries. We know this because the catalog itself survived. It was discovered in 1903 in the archive of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, where it had been deposited by the executor of Schreiber's estate, along with the rest of his papers. The catalog had been overlooked for 36 years, filed incorrectly, or perhaps deliberately obscured, and when it was finally examined, it caused a modest but genuine sensation in the small world of people who cared about such things. The catalog is written in a combination of German and Latin. The entries vary in length from 3 lines to 3 pages, and the entries are, as Schreiber's notebooks had always been, characteristically careful about making claims that he could not substantiate. He never wrote, "This is the skull of King X." He wrote, "Consistent with the documented physical characteristics of King X." He wrote, "Provenance suggests origin in the crypt of X." He wrote, "Provenance suggests origin in the crypt of X." He wrote, "Provenance suggests origin in the crypt of X." He wrote, "Provenance suggests origin in the crypt of X." He wrote, "Provenance suggests origin in the crypt of X." He wrote, "Provenance suggests origin in the crypt of X." He wrote, "If the accompanying documentation is authentic, This specimen is of the highest historical significance, if. The 11 entries in Die Bedeutenden cover a range of approximately 4 centuries of European history. The earliest is from the medieval period. The most recent is from the early 18th century. They represent, if Schreiber's claims are even partially correct, an extraordinary private accumulation of the physical remains of the historically powerful. We will look at a few of them. We have already encountered the third entry, the skull with the wound, acquired in the early 1830s, which Schreiber described as consistent with the documented injuries of a significant figure of the 15th century. His notes on this specimen run to 12 pages in Die Bedeutenden. They are the longest entry in the catalog, and while he never names the figure he has in mind, the description he gives of the wound, of its location, of the evidence he gathered over 20 years of investigation points, to anyone familiar with 15th century European history toward a very small number of candidates. The 15th century was a violent one. Kings and emperors and princes were killed in battle, executed by rivals, and sometimes both. The physical evidence of those deaths, the injuries described in contemporary chronicles, the wounds mentioned in autopsy reports where they existed, was something that Schreiber had studied with great care. The wound on his specimen was a blunt force injury to the left temporal bone, deep enough to have fractured the bone and penetrated the dura, which lies just beneath the inner surface of the skull. The person had survived this injury, the bone had begun to heal, but probably not for long. The nature of the fracture suggested a blow from above, from a weapon with a curved edge, and the location, the left temporal region, was consistent with injuries recorded in the chronicles of a specific battle. Schreiber knew what he thought. He was careful enough not to say it, but in the final page of his notes on this specimen, there is a passage that is different in tone from the rest, less measured, more personal. He writes, "I have held this bone in my hands many times over 20 years. I have measured it and described it and compared it against every relevant document I can find. I cannot prove what I believe, but I have spent enough time with the dead to know the difference between certainty and recognition. This I recognize." It is the most revealing thing he ever wrote. The 7th entry in Die Bedeutenden is unusual because it is not a skull. It is teeth. 4 teeth, specifically 2 upper molars and 2 lower premolars acquired in 1847 from a Parisian dealer who claimed they had come from the reliquary collection of a French noble family. The family had held, the dealer said, various personal relics of royal personages dating from the 16th and 17th centuries, and these teeth had been kept in a small ivory box that bore, on its lid, the initials of a specific queen of France. Schreiber was more skeptical of this specimen than of almost any other in the catalog. He wrote, "The provenance is entirely dependent on the word of the dealer, a man whose reliability I have no means of assessing, and on the authenticity of the ivory box, which I have not examined. I include this entry provisionally, but he kept the teeth. He kept them in the ivory box, which he had acquired along with the specimens, and he kept the box in the locked cabinet where Die Bedeutenden lived. And in 1851, 4 years after the acquisition, he made a journey to Paris, ostensibly to attend a medical conference, and spent a significant portion of his time there in archives, trying to trace the history of the noble family and the reliquary collection the dealer had described. He found some of what he was looking for. Not enough. The family had existed. The collection had existed. Whether the teeth were part of it, whether they were what the dealer claimed they were, he could not determine." The entry in Die Bedeutenden ends with a sentence that may be the most honest thing Schreiber ever wrote about his collection. "I keep these because I cannot bear to dispose of something that might matter." The 11th and final entry in Die Bedeutenden was added in 1861, 6 years before Schreiber's death. He was 70 years old when he acquired it. He had been slowing down for several years, his practice reduced, his travel curtailed, his collection essentially complete in the sense that he was no longer actively seeking new specimens. But this one came to him. It arrived in a wooden crate, accompanied by a letter from a retired civil servant in Prague named Hoffman, who explained that he had come into possession of certain items from the estate of a deceased archivist and believed, on the basis of documents in that estate, that some of the items might be of interest to Schreiber. The skull was in the crate. The documents were with the letter. The documents were extraordinary. They were copies. Hoffman made clear they were copies. not originals of records from the imperial archives relating to the transfer of remains during a renovation of a specific vault in the 1780s. The records were specific about dates, about personnel involved, about the disposition of various items, and they named explicitly a skull as having been removed from a particular location and entrusted to a particular custodian. The chain of custody from that custodian to the archivist to Hoffman to Schreiber was incomplete. There were gaps. Hoffman was honest about the gaps, but the skull itself, when Schreiber unpacked it and examined it, was consistent with the period and the individual named in the documents. The individual was not a king. He was an emperor. Schreiber's entry for specimen 11 is the shortest in Diebedutendan. It runs to less than half a page. He describes the physical characteristics, notes the documentation, identifies the gaps in provenance, and then stops. There is no speculation. There is no 20-year investigation. There is only the last line. I am 70 years old. I no longer have the time to investigate properly. I only know that I am glad it is here, and not elsewhere. To understand Schreiber's collection, it helps to understand that he was not alone. The 19th century was, in ways that are almost impossible to imagine from the vantage point of our own era, saturated with human remains. The bones of the dead moved through European society with a freedom that we would now find shocking. Medical schools needed cadavers for dissection, and legal sources were never sufficient to meet demand. And so an entire underground economy developed to supply what the law could not. Grave robbers called resurrection men in England, where the trade was particularly well organized, dug up freshly buried bodies and sold them to anatomy departments. Dealers in curiosities sold teeth and bones and occasionally skulls to collectors. Traveling exhibitions displayed remarkable specimens to paying audiences. Museums collected and displayed the remains of indigenous peoples from colonized territories with no thought for consent or dignity. Schreiber operated within this world. He was not the most extreme figure in it. He was, by the standards of his time and his field, relatively careful, relatively ethical, relatively concerned with the dignity of his specimens. He did not display them publicly. He did not seek sensation. He treated each skull as an object of scientific and historical interest, not as a trophy. But he was still a man of his era, and his era had a relationship with the physical remains of the dead that we no longer share. The idea that a skull had rights that it belonged to someone, or to their descendants, or to the place where it had been buried, was not an idea that figured prominently in the thinking of most physicians and collectors in the 1830s and 1840s. The dead were gone. What remained was evidence. What remained was material. What remained was, if you were a certain kind of person, a collection. This does not excuse what Schreiber did. Some of what he did was illegal, even by the standards of his own time. Some of it violated the trust that institutions placed in those who cared for historic sites and royal vaults. The skulls in Diebedutendan, if they are what Schreiber believed they were taken from places where they had been put with ceremony and intention, and they were taken without permission and for private purposes. These are real wrongs. They are worth naming. But they are not the only thing worth knowing about Anton Schreiber, and the collection he built, whatever its origins, whatever the methods used to build it, is now itself a piece of history, a document of a particular human obsession and a particular historical moment. It tells us things, not just about the skulls it contains, but about the man who gathered them and the world that made him possible. Every man leaves the world twice, once when his heart stops, once when the last person who knew him dies, but the bone remains. There is one extended piece of writing in Schreiber's surviving papers that is not anatomical, not scientific, not the careful documentation of a physician and collector. It is a letter, written in 1854, that he apparently composed but never sent. It is addressed to no one in particular. The salutation reads simply, "To whoever reads this after I am gone." In the letter, Schreiber tries to explain what he was doing, not the method, the meaning. He writes that he believes, and he is careful to call it a belief, not a fact, not a scientific conclusion, that there is something preserved in bone that is not preserved anywhere else. Not the soul, he says. He does not believe in the soul, at least not in any conventional religious sense. Something else, a kind of residue, a trace of the particular, specific, unrepeatable individual who lived inside that skull and looked out through those eye sockets and made decisions with that brain. He knows this is not scientific. He says so. He knows that a bone is calcium, phosphate, and protein and nothing more, and that the idea that it carries any trace of the person who produced it is, from a strictly material perspective, absurd. But he has spent 40 years handling skulls, and the thing he cannot explain, the thing he can only report, is that the ones he has held longest feel different from the ones he acquired recently. Familiar. In the way that a book you have read many times feels familiar, as if the repeated contact has established something, as if attention, sustained over long enough a period, changes the relationship between the observer and the observed. He knows this is probably a quality of his own perception, not of the bone. He knows he is probably imagining it, but he keeps the collection anyway, because the alternative, dispersing it, selling the pieces, allowing them to scatter into other hands and other contexts, would feel like a kind of abandonment. And Schreiber, whatever else he was not a man who abandoned things. The last 7 years of Schreiber's life were quiet. He was still in the house near the Graben. He still had the collection. He still spent time in the third-floor room, moving among the shelves with the careful and slightly stiff gait of a man in his 70s who has spent most of his life on his feet. His eyesight had declined enough that he needed spectacles for close work. His hands, once so precise, had developed a slight tremor that made him reluctant to handle the more fragile specimens. He was not unhappy. The record gives no impression of unhappiness. He had his books. He had his correspondence, which remained extensive even as his circle of contemporaries narrowed through death. He had a housekeeper named Rosa who had been with him for 22 years and who managed his domestic life with the same quiet efficiency that he managed his collection. He had occasional visitors, former students, colleagues who passed through Vienna, the rare researcher who had heard of the collection and sought him out. And he had the room. He went there every day, in the late afternoon, when the diffuse gray light through the opaque glass was at its best, that particular quality of illumination that made the bone look somehow liquid, as if the skulls were floating in a pale medium. He would walk the length of the room slowly, stopping sometimes at a particular shelf, sometimes removing a specimen and turning it in his hands, sometimes simply standing and looking. Rosa said, in an interview given years after his death, that she had sometimes watched him through the half-open door and that it had never seemed strange to her, or frightening, or sad. It seemed, she said, like what some men did in churches, standing in a particular place, in a particular quality of light, with a particular quality of attention. She could not name it more precisely than that. She said she thought he was happy there. Schreiber had no children. He had never married. He had, as far as the records show, no close family surviving by the time of his death. The collection, all 487 skulls of it by 1867, and the notebooks, and the locked cabinet with die Bedeutenden inside, needed somewhere to go. He spent several years, in the early 1860s, trying to find it a proper home. He approached the university, he approached the Natural History Museum, which was then being organized as a major imperial institution. He approached the Academy of Sciences. None of them wanted the whole collection. The problem was the provenance. Not all of it, the majority of the collection was uncontroversial, and the anatomical specimens were of genuine scientific value. But the historically significant specimens, the ones in die Bedeutenden, were a different matter. Accepting them meant accepting questions about how they had been acquired. It meant, potentially, accepting responsibility for what to do if the questions became public. If the families of the individuals named in Schreiber's notes, the royal families of Europe, with their lawyers and their sensitivity about such things, came asking. No institution wanted that risk. In the end, Schreiber divided the collection in his will. The anatomical specimens, the 476 skulls of ordinary people, went to the university medical faculty, where they were used for teaching for several decades before being eventually dispersed or lost. The notebooks went to the Academy of Sciences archive, where they were misfiled and forgotten for 36 years. And die Bedeutenden, the locked cabinet, and its contents, and the private catalog he left to a colleague named Weiss, a younger physician who had been one of his most frequent visitors in the last years, and who had, Schreiber apparently trusted, the discretion to handle them appropriately. Weiss did not publish anything about the contents. He kept the cabinet for the rest of his own life, and when he died in 1891, it passed to his son, who appears to have had no idea what it contained and who deposited it, along with various other papers from his father's estate, in the Academy of Sciences archive, where it sat for 12 years, misfiled, until 1903. The archivist who found Dibadutenden in 1903 was a young man named Fleischer who had recently joined the Academy of Sciences and who was working through a backlog of uncatalogued materials from the second half of the 19th century. He found the locked cabinet first. He did not have a key. He forced the lock carefully with tools borrowed from the maintenance department and found inside a series of small wooden boxes, each labeled in a handwriting he did not immediately recognize. He opened the first box and found a human tooth. He opened the second and found 4 more teeth in a small ivory box with initials on the lid. He opened the third and found a skull. He found the catalog in a separate folder at the back of the cabinet. He read it, or as much of it as his Latin would allow, in a single sitting. Then he went to find his supervisor. His supervisor, a man named Braun, who had been at the Academy for 30 years and who had seen a great many unexpected things come through the archive, read the catalog more carefully. He made a list of what it contained. He sat with the list for a long time. Then he made a decision that was, in retrospect, probably the only sensible one available to him. He refiled everything: the cabinet, the contents, the catalog, the notebooks. He wrote a brief internal memorandum noting the existence of the materials and indicating that they required further assessment before being made publicly available. He filed the memorandum in a folder that was itself quickly buried under subsequent paperwork. The collection sat for another 40 years. It was rediscovered a second time in 1943, by which point the Academy of Sciences had other things to worry about and was again refiled. The third and final rediscovery came in 1961, when a historian named Klein was researching the history of 19th century Austrian anatomical science and came across Braun's memorandum while working through institutional records. Klein published a paper in 1963 about Schreiber and his collection. It was the first public account of Dibadutenden, and it was careful, very careful, in the way that academic papers about potentially sensitive subjects are careful about making claims. Klein described the catalog. He described the 11 entries. He did not assert that any of the skulls were what Schreiber had believed them to be. He concluded that the collection represented a remarkable case study in the psychology of the 19th century collector, and left it at that. The location of the physical specimens after 1963 is a matter of some uncertainty. The catalog is in the Academy of Sciences archive and is accessible to researchers. The cabinet and its contents have not been publicly located. Whether they are still in the archive, somewhere in the deep stacks, or whether they were at some point quietly disposed of, is not known. In the town of Hollenstein an der Wibs, the church where 8-year-old Anton Schreiber sat on the floor of the charnel house and held a stranger's skull in his hands, is still standing. It has been renovated twice since 1799. The charnel house behind the sacristy is now a storage room. The skulls that were there in Schreiber's childhood were moved at some point to the municipal cemetery, or disposed of, or simply lost. The record does not say. The house near the Graben in Vienna, where Schreiber built his collection, does not exist. The building was demolished in 1910 as part of a municipal improvement project. An apartment block stands on the site. None of the current residents, almost certainly, have any idea what was on the 3rd floor of the building that stood there before. The notebooks are in the Academy archive, accessible, occasionally consulted by historians of medicine and science. They are detailed and precise and not particularly easy to read. The handwriting requires practice, and the specialized Latin requires knowledge. But they are there. The 40 years of Schreiber's thinking, laid down in small black ink on yellowing paper, preserved in a way that bone is not always preserved. The skulls themselves, the ordinary ones, the 476, the ones that went to the university, are mostly gone. Dispersed, lost, absorbed into other collections, or simply discarded when anatomy teaching moved on to newer methods and newer materials. The people who own them are doubly anonymous now. They were unknown in Schreiber's time. They are unknown now. And Dibadutenden the 11, the potentially significant, the ones that might be kings, We do not know where they are. Perhaps they are still in the archive, in their boxes, in the dark, waiting for a fourth accidental discovery. Perhaps they are somewhere else entirely. Perhaps, as Schreiber might have said, they are simply resting, waiting, in the patient way of old bone, for someone to come and pay attention. Anton Schreiber died on the 14th of March, 1867, in the house near the Graben. His housekeeper Rosa found him in the morning, in his bed, with no sign that his death had been anything other than quiet. He was 76 years old. He had not been in the collection room for 3 days before his death. Rosa noted this in a brief account she gave to the executor of the estate because it was unusual. He had been in his study mostly, reading, writing letters. Looking out the window at the street below, on the morning of the day before he died, he asked Rosa to bring him a cup of tea and a specific notebook from his study shelf, the second of the 3 general catalogs, the one that covered the years 1819 to 1831. He spent the morning with it. Rosa brought him a second cup of tea at noon and found him with the notebook closed on his lap and his eyes shut, and a quality of stillness about him that she described carefully as being not like sleep. He was awake. He opened his eyes when she came in. He thanked her for the tea. That afternoon, he went up to the collection room, alone, as always. He was there for 2 hours. When he came down, he seemed, Rosa said, very calm. Peaceful, she said, like a man who has settled something. The next morning, he did not wake up. What he was thinking, those last 2 hours in the room, is not recorded anywhere. He left no final entry in any notebook. He left no deathbed statement, no letter to be opened after his death, no words intended for posterity beyond what was already in the archive. He left, instead, the collection. 487 skulls in a room above the Graben, in the fading March light, with their labels and their catalog numbers and their long, patient silence. It is the thing he said most clearly. Across the century and a half between his life and ours, it is still what he is saying. Some things are worth keeping. Some people are worth remembering. And sometimes the only way to say that the only proof you can offer is to hold something carefully for a very long time and refuse to let go.